You have tuned into The Voice of Medicine, the medical podcast filled with remarkable stories, first-hand experience, important research, and valuable life lessons. Open your mind, relax, and enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Voice of Medicine. Today we have a fascinating guest from Denmark. Fatima AlZahra'a Alatraktchi is a researcher and entrepreneur in micro and nanosensing. She founded a company called PreDiagnose. We will discuss her research, how she was able, how to detect bacteria with sensors, being more sensitive than the current state-of-art procedures are. We will discuss how she found her way to this type of research and to this field of science. We will also discuss how she managed to implement the research, thus closing the gap between theory and practice.
Thank you, Michael.
Fatima, before we get really deep, into the topics of your research, of your company, how you got there, I wanna ask you a question. You are from Denmark. You studied there. That's where you founded your company. Would you say that Denmark offers a lot of possibilities for people who are passionate about science to, foster that interest? So, is there enough going on for future scientists in Denmark?
Definitely. I mean, the environment here is really encouraging both science and entrepreneurship, and the opportunities, especially not just in Denmark, but also in Europe for startups, but especially in Denmark because it's so encouraged by the government and it's encouraged by the universities. It's really a perfect environment to start something up, especially something high tech. And the universities have a lot of programs for young researchers and for startups. So they really try to encourage this new thinking and creativity, and I think it's actually paying off now.
Speaking about passion, I always wonder, how does one get into the field where he's right now, Ed? Usually, people think that it's some kind of innate interest, but I would say that it's rather the fact that you're being exposed to certain things, and then you realize, wow, okay, this is fascinating, and I want to find out more. And so my following question would be, how did you get into biology, biotechnology, all the stuff that you're right now, and what was basically the path?
The path actually started back when I was very young, in early school. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of everything I could get my hands on within science and also within science fiction and everything that is just not traditional. And I read about nanotechnology, and I was sold immediately. I wanted to study more within physics and within bio-nanotechnology, and that's what I did later on. Even though my grades could get me into other educations that require even higher grades, but I chose this, and that's where I ended. But you're right. It's in the end, it's about what you're exposed to. So it was because I was exposed to a lot of discussions with the people about what is out there in science. Because it was especially this with the bacterial communication. It's pretty new. So it was because I was reading. It was because I was talking to people that I learned that there is something cutting edge out there that really caught my interest.
I'm super happy that you mentioned this because when I talk to people, a lot of times there's this misconception. People ask themselves, what am I interested in? And they sort of kind of look for the answer within them. But the answer is usually outside. So you don't know what you like or what is really, what can be your passion until you get exposed to, a large amount of things. And that's why it's exactly as you said. it's very important for people to read, to talk to people, and the funny thing is sometimes there is stuff that you don't know about that does exist, but it does. And might be your career path later on.
Exactly, yeah. And when even though I was so certain about I wanted to read something within physics and nanotechnology and atomic physics back then, when I was about to choose my study when I finished high school, I said to myself, okay, maybe I'm so fixed on this, but I'm gonna read everything that is out there, what kind of educations are out there, and I read all kind of stuff, and still I was convinced that this passion I had, it was still the right one, and then I chose it. So it's true, you cannot just search within you, because what do you have within you without inputs from the outside? Then perhaps you have nothing.
I absolutely agree. Another thing which probably you can explain to me is, so you chose a field. Okay, that's step number one. But then from all the living organisms that you could study, doesn't matter how small, you decided to look into bacteria. Why bacteria? Why is bacteria so fascinating?
It was exactly because I learned that they talked together. I thought it was crazy that they had this social community and they were social organisms. It was completely fascinating, and that's why I decided to look more into it.
It sounds crazy, for a lay person just like me to hear that bacteria are talking to each other, have social structure. It's I think for anybody out there, these kind of things are only associated with human beings and maybe animal kingdom, the primates, mammals, stuff like that. But then to hear that bacteria are sort of communicating, perhaps even organizing themselves and so on, it's sounds like science fiction indeed.
Yes, and it's so complex, and they have so complex social structures, and it just when I heard about it, and when I read more about it, it just I immediately thought it was completely like humans. I mean, a lot of structures, a lot of their conflicts they're solving, or the way that they act, it's a lot like humans. And I really like this connection, because just beside my work, I write books, and I've written about students that act like countries. So this parallel thing between small groups and larger groups, it was also there in science between bacteria and human beings.
Now I would like to really focus on your work. So we already established for our audience that bacteria talk to each other. How do they do that, and why do they communicate in the first place?
Why? It's because they have the genetics to do it, but how they do it is by excreting some molecules, chemical molecules that other bacteria can sense. And by this, they can establish a connection. So they read, if you think about it like words, they shout a word out there. It's, of course, a chemical. And then another bacteria receives it and translates it to a specific action, for example. And then they can respond to that.
Do all bacteria speak the same language? So do all emit the same molecules?
No. So they have sometimes they have their specific language within the bacterial families. Sometimes they have common chemicals that they all understand. They can have secret languages from each other. So it's like I would speak Danish and you speak English, and then we wouldn't. If I didn't know your language, I wouldn't understand what you were saying. So they have these structures. It's really interesting.
Now, what happens when two bacteria meet each other and they do not speak the same language?
First of all, if we're talking about cell level, so it's not like one single bacteria, because usually when I look at it, at least it's colonies, or it's cultures. So it's you have to have more than one.
So let's call them bacteria nations.
Yeah, yes. We have to have more than one, because you need their interactions. I don't. It really depends on the circumstances. It depends on the environment they're in. But sometimes they collaborate. So they help each other to coexist. And actually, for the human body, it's really good that there is diversity of bacteria. But if they don't talk each other's language, it's not necessarily. It really depends on the context.
So, could, for example, one of the topics that the bacteria colonies talk to each other about is, I don't know, dividing their life environment. So, for example, one colony says, "Guys, we are staying over here, and you are staying over there, and until you're not crossing our borders, everything is fine."
Sometimes it's really interesting because sometimes bacteria within the same family, they say, okay, so now we're a group here. Some of us will settle. We will build something like a really strong castle. It's called a biofilm. And they sit together, protect themselves with all kind of chemicals that will work as a shield or like a wall against, for example, antibiotics that comes from the outside or attacks from the outside, the immune system. And then they settle there and clump together and aggregate. And then some of these bacteria, other part of the family, they float around in the human body or wherever they are, just to find other places to colonize and settle. And that's really interesting because somehow this is a good strategy for survival. If they just settle one place and don't go out and try to explore and find better places to colonize, then they don't really grow more. And for them, it's about survival and growth.
To me, it very much sounds more like military tactics, which is even more frightening than, that bacteria do this.
Yes, and that's also why I use this reference in my TED Talk.
Do you think, speaking as a layperson, do you think that perhaps because even, let's say the very small organisms such as bacteria act like this could be perhaps an explanation why down the line we act like this? Because we behave very much the same, it seems to me.
I would love to study the philosophy of this because there are things we could definitely learn from bacteria about how we should treat each other. Diversity is one of them. Diversity is really good, and bacteria are also good at collaborating. They are good at working together for the better good of the community. Sometimes they can have some bacterial strains, and it's typically the pathogenic strains, the disease-causing strains that suddenly try to dominate everything and outcompete the others. And this is also what happens with us, poor human beings.
Definitely. So somebody wakes up one morning and says, well, I'm going to be a boss here. And so it happens with bacteria as well. Okay.
If only it was as simple as being a boss, because we all need bosses sometimes. But it's more about, especially the pathogenic bacteria. They can really they can really start creating a war against the other type of bacteria around them, just to kill them, and so they can dominate and be the real rulers wherever they are, especially in the human body.
So the real struggle for survival on a cellular level. Okay. The other thing which I really enjoyed about your work is it did not stay on paper. So what a lot of times happens, at least from my perspective, is there is great research out there. People find things which are rule-breaking, groundbreaking, but they never really get implemented. And you actually managed to implement it. And I would love you to tell us, perhaps also for other researchers out there, for students, sort of as a beacon of hope that any research can really be implemented if certain steps maybe are followed. So my question to you, how did you get from paper, from the lab, onto finding your company and actually doing something?
So there are several parts of this. First of all, when I studied, I was really determined that this should never stay just as some text out in cyberspace. It should go out there and help, because otherwise all the research I've done, it's wasted unless someone other picks it up and try to implement it at hospitals. And what if no one does that? So I was really determined that this is not something that should just stay in the lab. And that's also why I tried to make, or I did a clinical trial throughout my studies to try to test this invention or the sensor I developed on real patients. And that worked out. And it didn't even only work out. We found out that we had discoveries that we would never have discovered if we didn't have something as sensitive as my sensor. So this was part of it. Another part was that I thought, okay, so now this is a lot of knowledge I have gained, a lot of know-how. It's not necessarily only the sensor or the method I developed throughout my studies, but it's also the know-how I have to develop much more than I have done so far. So what do I do with that? And that's why I decided to create a company where I can translate all of this into real action that can benefit human beings.
I think at this point it would be very good to maybe a little bit explain, perhaps with an example, how it really works. So, how do you implement the research that you've done? So somebody comes to you, I don't know, maybe a hospital or practice, or even a patient, and they ask you for help in detecting bacteria early. How can we imagine that?
So usually doctors suspect certain kind of infections in human beings, and or in their patients, and these infections are typically treated sometimes without even knowing what bacteria it is, because it's also expensive to diagnose. So usually they just give an antibiotic that should work, and if it doesn't, then they change the antibiotic, and sometimes they send samples out for diagnosis, and then they realize, okay, we have been treating with something that isn't as specific as it should have. So knowing what, or identifying the bacteria that is causing a specific disease or a specific symptoms is really important. And that's what I can do with my technology. I have developed the technology that can identify the bacteria that is in question, and based on that, the doctors can treat very specifically. And what we found out is, what the sensors, they can detect very fast. It's within seconds to minutes that we can get an answer, while today it can take up to several days to get a diagnosis. That's one thing. Another thing is the methods today aren't sensitive enough to catch the very early infections, or infections that are hidden in the body. And this is something we can do with the sensors, because in PreDiagnose we have developed something that is so sensitive that it can capture even very early infections.
Basically, what you did is you shortened the time that is needed for the diagnosis, and second, you came up with a very, how should I say, precise and sensitive method how to catch early stages of any kind of infection.
Exactly, and when I say infection, it's kind of a general term. It's in medicine or in microbiology, we also call it colonization, because it didn't really cause any symptoms yet. So it is there in the body. It's not hurtful yet, but it will potentially be. So we can catch the bacteria so early, even before we can see symptoms. And because what I detect is virulent activity, then we can also say something about are these bacteria going to do something harmful or not?
You can specify what kind of troops have landed where and if they will do something in the future. Oh, that's amazing.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it.
Let me ask you a different question. So I'm pretty sure that during the development of this, you probably worked with physicians a lot, and they must have been working with the old school method. So probably growing a culture of bacteria and then seeing if there is something or not. So how was it to work with them, introducing them into basically to this new development and the possibilities? What were their reactions?
The doctors I have been working with have been very open-minded. So they were really interested in the newest research and then the newest ways possible to help their patients. And what I sensed was a real interest in helping their patients. And I'm really grateful I've been able to work with such people. Doctors actually in many different hospitals in Denmark are just interested in the very best for the treatment of their patients. So even though they are used to traditional methods, they are also open to see what is out there that we can either replace or supplement the existing methods with. And that's where my methods came into interest for them, because it can actually be an assisting tool as a complementary to their diagnosis system.
It's very important to keep a growth mindset, especially in healthcare, which needs to develop continuously. To make things work better, perhaps even being more affordable and efficient.
Exactly, and it's not only that; it's also that they know somewhere that if they do this and it works, because sometimes we do clinical trials and it doesn't work, and then we change something and it works perfectly. So when they are in this process, they are leaders within this field. Then other hospitals in the world will look at them and see how their practice is going. And that is really important also for doctors. So I'm really grateful. I've been working with open-minded doctors here.
I'm also very grateful that you had people around you who were not putting up barriers, but instead of inviting you and letting you to take them on this journey. And I am pretty sure that beside the amazing people that you had around, you also maybe have faced challenges. What would you say on the path from first, finding out about bacteria potentially communicating with each other up until now, where you are right now with your company? What was the biggest challenge that you had to face, and how did you work around
it? There are many challenges, both technical challenges and also cultural challenges, as you say. So sometimes you need yourself to be able to speak different languages, because by training I'm a physicist, I'm an engineer, and to suddenly go deep into microbiology and deep into medicine, it's really it was a challenge, because that's not my background. So I had to be able to talk different languages to doctors and to microbiologists and to physicists. So it was a challenge, and the way you act around doctors and around nurses is also different than how you interact with the colleagues in research. So this is something that I had to learn throughout the way, and I think I've learned a lot. It has been a really interesting experience. But the technical challenges, that's the part no one really knows about. That's where you're in the lab and really have your head against the wall and you don't know what to do sometimes. And that's also a challenge when things don't work out. And people usually don't talk about that part because it's easily forgotten when you have success.
Plus, we like to we like to look at the successful story and sort of wonder and be amazed. Yeah, exactly. We love to be amazed of it's amazing what she has done. But you're right. We do not see the hours that you were hitting your head against the wall,
Yeah.
probably cursing the whole idea and saying just.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful that you said that, when to say it in a metaphor, if you want to, live with the wolves, you have to howl like a wolf. Um, could you give us an example? What exactly did you have to change about your behavior or communication so you were, let's say, more accepted or a part of the medical environment, so people would be more open to you and your ideas?
What I observed, so I'm an observer. So what I did in the beginning was really just observing how the environment is. I went sometimes without even doing any work or doing very light work and just see how doctors operate, how nurses operate. And I quickly learned that, and maybe it's obvious for medical people, but for me it was new, that nurses really run a lot of the show. And they work a lot, and they are really busy, and I'm not it's not the research that is important here. What is important is the patient and how they can get through the day with their busy schedules. So for me it was really about being as invisible as possible, not to get in the way, and really respect how the machinery in there, how they, even though they have problems, even though they have personal problems, because I was backstage, I could see everything. And when they got into the patients, into the room with the patients, then they smiled and they were professional. It was amazing to experience. So what I learned from that is that you need to be humble, and you really need to respect that what is in centrum here is not you and your work. It's really them and the patients.
Wow, I think this is one of the greatest advice that I ever had on my show. So do not come there and act like you're the big scientist running this place.
That is going to solve all kind of problems, and I have seen examples of that. It never ended well.
Exactly. Okay. No, it's a beautiful advice, and I think you said something very important, which is I think essential for any kind of scientist or anybody who really wants to start with off with the right foot. First, you have to observe. You have to come and be just quietly look at the stuff, understand what's going on, especially in the social realm, as you said, and then you can start acting.
Yes.
But it really requires the understanding. Fatima, you're quite young for the fact what you have already accomplished and how you come so far. Did you ever imagine that you are gonna be where you're right now?
I have always been ambitious, so I'm not gonna lie, but it's not. I mean, you can never predict how things will go. I could have been working in the lab and making things work out, and it would work fine. But how would I know that in the end, when I tested on the patients, that I would discover that so many patients had the bacteria no one knew about? So there are things you cannot foresee, but I have always been hardworking, and I always wanted to do something with all of my knowledge. So it would have been tragic if I didn't try to get it out there. So in terms of doing something that is meaningful for me and for what I think is meaningful for what I can contribute with to the society is something I have always wanted to do.
I was also wondering about your about the thought process of your work. So what happens to a lot of researchers or scientists in general is they submerge in their field so much that they are on a complete different level of understanding of their field. It's something what looks to a layperson rather maybe simple, once you get really deep, you start to see the intricate details of certain things. And then, during this submerging, perhaps out of nowhere, a creative thought comes to you, or maybe you are being again, as we already talked, exposed to something, and that gives you the initial kickstart to actually come up with the idea that you build on. And how was it for you? So, you probably you looked into the field, you were reading books, studying, but there's always this one moment which basically is the game changer. Did you have that?
I did several times, and I still have these moments, especially in during my work in PreDiagnose. I had a game changer where I invented a method that can detect all sort of bacteria in all sort of body fluids, and that's, for me, it's a game changer, but it's also something that means that I can expand the work a lot more than I ever imagined. So I've had a lot of these moments, and sometimes you cannot even follow up on all of the ideas you have. So you also have to pick which ones you want to proceed with. And that's even a bigger challenge, at least for me.
I would suggest you to get a notebook and write those things down.
I do all the time.
Write them down and, implement them. We will all be grateful to you for doing that.
Thank you. I actually have a pen and a paper next to me when I sleep, because sometimes it just comes and I really need to get it down before I forget.
It's funny that you're saying it. It seems to be a common thing for a lot of people who are, who have this inventive minds. I read about some scientists, but also some CEOs from companies who really do that. They have a notepad and a pen next to their or on their night tables. So it's fascinating that you said that too. Fatima, I want to ask you sort of a personal question. You don't need to answer that if you don't want to. Mm-hmm. So in one of my talks, I talked to Professor Selva Alhaza from Saudi Arabia, from the King Faisal Hospital. She's a professor of ophthalmology. And our talk was embedded in her history and the history of her family. And bottom line was, it was not easy for her as a girl, and then later on as a woman with her background, to kind of convince her environment, but also the sort of certain parts of her family, that education is very important and that it leads to a better future also for a woman. Mm-hmm. Now, did you experience anything like that too, or do you perhaps know from some of your friends that have to face that? And what would be your advice for anybody who might, get second-guessed on a scientific career?
Okay, I never had that. It's actually my parents and my family that have always encouraged me to study. And
beautiful. Then I'm very happy for you.
It's non-negotiable that I should have a university study, and my siblings as well. So it's kind of it's a path that we should take, having an education to, just to have a real life where you can think on your own and be independent. That's really important. So I have never had that. I don't know if you can give an advice because it's usually the parents you need to advise. What is important in life is to be independent. You shouldn't depend on anyone, and not on your parents, not on the men in your family. If you say that the problem is that she was that they thought that she couldn't because she's a girl, if you're independent, then you can choose your own path in life. And I don't think it's an advice. I think it's something we all know. So it's just really important to keep this in mind all the time. The independency is really important.
Well, in her case, it was very, I would say, it was very specific, because her dad had to basically convince his family, where he did not succeed. So he actually left the family for a while.
Okay.
They didn't want him to get education because he was rich, The idea there was, listen, you already got everything. Why do you need to be educated? But when because now he became her role model, right? I mean, she saw it from him, how much the education or the possibility of being educated actually meant to him. Then he left Saudi Arabia, he went to the USA and did basically his studies there. He became her role model. So she basically went also on this path of education, science and so on. But of course, when you come back, you always get second guessed, from people who are rather traditional or conservative. So this is basically why I asked you.
Okay, but I've gotten this question in another way. Like, if you get really rich, then will you stop everything you're doing? And of course not, because again, it's all about all of this know-how, all of this knowledge that you have. If you don't use it, then it's really tragic.
Absolutely. But, I wouldn't worry about that in your case. You do sound from the very moment on super hungry for knowledge anyways. And on top of that, I mean, you already developed a persevering passion for your field. So I do not think that even if you become super rich, this could be a problem for you.
We were talking about this lady. So I think it's kind of the same case, that even though she's really rich or her dad is really rich, so when they question why will you take an education, it's not to support himself, it's to do something valuable for the society, I guess.
Yeah, perhaps it's really this higher idea of the higher good. As you also mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah.
Also, I know it's not really easy to give motivational speeches or pep talks to people. But if you could give our listeners, especially the younger generation, an advice of how to do something meaningful and change the course of things for the better, just like you did, what would you advise them with?
I would say don't necessarily go for something you're passionate about. Go something that is meaningful, because you may have many different passions, but what is really meaningful for your life, what really adds value to you and to the society, that's where you should go. So all of this about, as you said in the beginning, having a passion, looking within, all of this, it's sometimes not even at least for me, that's how I see it. It's not the way to go forward. It's what is needed out there. How can you help other human beings? And how can you combine the passion and the meaningfulness? That would be my advice.
Fatima, thank you very much for taking your time, being on my program, talking to me.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
This was The Voice of Medicine. Make sure you tune in next time and take care.